Thank you for joining the I Am Possible, which is India's first Future Tech Meets Sustainability podcast. Today, I'm delighted and honored to have with me Dr. Catalina Lopez-Correa, who's the Chief Scientific Officer at Genome Canada. Earlier, she was the Executive Director of the Canadian COVID-19 Genomics Network, CSO and Vice-President Sectors at Genome, British Columbia, CSO and Vice-President Scientific Affairs at Genome, Quebec, Senior Research Leader with pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly in the US, the renowned Decode Genetics Lab in Iceland, and two biotech companies in the UK, Genomica and Informax, and is trained in innovation leadership at the Singularity University. Before joining Genome Canada, Dr. Lopez-Correa was Chief Operating Officer at Ruta N Medellin. In this capacity, she coordinated the operations of a world-class innovation hub that uses cutting-edge technologies and approaches to solve the city's most pressing social and economic challenges. Prior to joining Ruta N in 2017, Dr. Lopez-Correa received the Canadian Senate 150th Anniversary Medal. In 2013, she was recognized by National Order of Merit Award in the rank of officer appointed by the Honorable President of the Republic of Colombia. In 2012, she was recognized as one of the top 100 Colombians living abroad. So, Doctor, it's a complete pleasure and honor to have you on the podcast. Sincerely appreciate you taking time and being part of a humble effort to raise awareness on exponential technologies. So, would you like to start with describing your role at Genome Canada and the works that you have been involved in?
Wonderful. Well, yeah. And first, Eddie, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this podcast. I am a great believer that genomics is a technology that is transforming the world, and is a technology that has a huge potential, not only in Canada, where I work presently, but also huge potential in emerging economies and countries that are starting to develop these technologies, as countries in Latin America and as India, where, again, genomics has a great potential. So my role as Chief Scientific Officer at Genome Canada really is all about helping and supporting and advancing the implementation of genomic technologies across different economic sectors. So about 60% of our portfolio at Genome Canada is on human health, but we do have projects also in the area of agriculture, of course, always using genomics. We have also projects in areas of forestry, natural resources, mining, climate change, fisheries and aquaculture. But again, the largest part of the portfolio is on genomics and health, and basically using genomics on the entire healthcare continuum. We at Genome Canada have projects that are focusing on using genomics for prevention of diseases, also using genomics for diagnosis, genomics also to guide the treatment of the disease, and genomics to guide the prognosis of the disease. So the entire healthcare continuum. And we work and we are supporting scientists across all Canada, in the different universities in Canada, and working also with the receptors or users of genomics. In the case of health, we work then with the Ministry of Health, with healthcare providers across Canada that are the ones that are really using this technology to diagnose and treat their patients.
So you mentioned that genomics as a technology is something which can completely transform the world, and you also mentioned that it can transform the emerging economies, the India and other nations, who really need, obviously our healthcare currently requires the complete upend, because the technology is accelerating, but we're still holding on to the old ways of how we do healthcare or education. And you mentioned that genomics is got this huge potential of completely transforming the world. Would you like to elaborate on that? How and which are the areas in the healthcare specific where genomics is going to create the largest impact?
Yeah, so I can give you a few examples in rare diseases, in cancer, but I would like to start, I think, with the most relevant example right now, which is COVID-19. We have been all through these 2 years of critical situation in the planet with COVID-19, with this pandemic. And what we have seen, not just in Canada, in Europe, in the US, but across the world, in India, in Latin America, in Africa, is that we are now using genomics to sequence, of course, this virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, to understand the different variants. What are those variants of concern? How are those variants transmitted? And we all know that this virus sees no borders. For the virus, there's no, here is India, and here is the US, and here is Canada, and this is the border, and I shouldn't cross here, I need a visa. There's no concept of border for the virus. And for us, that's the way we should handle genomics also in a global scale, in a global, really global scale, where we could really use this technology to get information about the transmission and distribution of this virus at a global level. And this is exactly what we did. There's more than now 7 million genomes, viral genomes that have been sequenced. India has been actively sequencing. Canada has been actively sequencing. And actually, we say, at least in Canada, and we'll say, I will think that is globally, that we are saying that with COVID-19, genomics is really getting out of the lab. Is not anymore a technology just for the scientists working in the lab with their experiments, but it's a technology that everybody around the world needs and understands. And I think big part of that was, again, because of COVID, because now we know that the difference between Delta and Omicron, these variants and all these things that we're talking about, the new variant of concern, the new Omicron, all these are the only way to see those variants is with genomics, is really sequencing and seeing all the DNA, all the letters, all the code of all the genetic code of the virus. So I think COVID-19 has been a very powerful example of the use and application of genomics across the world. Now, there is also areas like rare diseases. And rare diseases are, we call them rare diseases, and those are mostly severe syndromes in children that are individually rare. So each of those diseases is rare, but collectively they're very common. So they become really a common challenge for the healthcare system, and of course for the families and for the patients. Now, in many cases, those diseases take very, very long time to diagnose when we use the conventional approach for diagnosis. Now, there's many now studies that shows that by using genomics and using in particular whole genome sequence, which is reading the entire DNA of a human being, we can find those mutations and we can really make a much more accurate diagnosis, and in many cases, open paths for treatment of those patients with rare diseases. The other area that where genomics is really having a great impact at a global scale is in oncology, in cancer research, and in treating cancer patients. We have seen now great advancements in how we get to a much more precise and personalized treatment using genomics. So basically, giving the right drug to the right patient at the right dose at the right time, based on our genes and based on our genome. And I would say with cancer, what is important is that we are no longer thinking about, oh, this is breast cancer or this is colon cancer. It's not important really where the cancer is located. What is important is the molecular signature of that cancer. We might treat exactly the same way a colon cancer in one patient and a breast cancer in another one if they have the same molecular signature. So again, it's a technology that is also getting much cheaper and much easier to access, and that means a higher impact. And I will end this part also making a parallel with the informatics revolution. If we remember in the 60s and the 70s, I remember my father had a computer that was almost the size of a room, had to be refrigerated, was noisy, was heavy, was complicated. and had less memory than a cell phone that we have today. And same thing was happening with genomics. We are increasing the speed, increasing the throughput, increasing the quality, decreasing the cost, and decreasing the size. Same parallel as we are seeing with informatics.
Right. Yes, the growth in exponential technologies and it touching all different sectors is going to be so awesome for every business sectors and even consumers. You mentioned that with throughout the world, because of our genome sequencing capabilities, we have sequence these viruses, and there's lots that we have learned from these viruses. What's the learnings that from sequencing these viruses, and do you think that globally we are now one step ahead and possibly prepared for maybe another pandemic by the learnings from these viruses?
That's a very good question, and I think we are much better prepared. We know now that we can use genomics to help us trace and understand the distribution of these viruses and these pathogens, like the SARS-CoV-2 virus for COVID-19. We use that to see, okay, there is Omicron appearing in this part of the world, and now suddenly is being distributed and is appearing in these other regions of the world. We can make public health and policy decisions based on the understanding of where the virus is. So it's really helping us at many levels, and is also really helping us because, as I say, the technology is much cheaper and easier to use. So we can do it not just in Canada, but across the world. In Africa, there were different countries that were making efforts to train people to get the data. Now, the big challenge, because there's still, of course, the world is not perfect, and it's not that we have solved all the challenges. The biggest challenge I see we have now is not the data generation. We are able to sequence, we are able to produce, and there's still challenges in terms of the access to equipment, access to reagents in some regions of the world that have limited resources. That remains a challenge. But I think the biggest challenge now is what do we do and how we manage the data. And that was a challenge for Canada. That was a challenge for the US. That was a challenge for India. That was a challenge for the entire world, because we are used, again, to keep the data in our countries. And as I say, the virus sees no borders. The virus goes everywhere. And yet the data stays in my lab, in my country, in my province, in my region. And I don't share it because I'm afraid that maybe you will find something secret. And actually, the reality, the value of the data is when we share it at a global level, when we are able to use that data for the global good, for really global health. So I think the challenge of data sharing is a very important one.
Right. I hope that organizations, nations understand that the world where we're going into is going to be a much open and decentralized world, because at least the millennials, the Gen Zs, they understand that siloed approaches have only created closed borders. And if we are talking about a world where we can be collaborative and leverage each other's benefits, because that was plain to see. I mean, the only reason we got to a vaccine in under a couple of months in COVID-19 was because of the global collaboration. So I hope there is more data sharing. You mentioned about genome sequencing, becoming cheaper. 2000, the genome project was $1 billion, and now it's come down to maybe like $1,000, and hopefully it'll come down much more. And it's you guys are looking at not just preventive but diagnosis and even treatment of rare disease. Tell me, how do you see that genome sequencing becoming a compulsory for healthcare? And if it does become compulsory, how would it transform healthcare?
Yes, well, I do see that whole genome sequencing, so getting our genome, will be, almost as we do MRI and we do X-rays. maybe X-rays. X-rays were expensive and difficult to get, and MRIs were expensive and difficult to get years ago. Now, MRI is not super cheap, but it's not such a big deal. Same for X-rays. So these are part of the advancements and that we are seeing in genomics, that they are becoming more ubiquitous, and there's a technology that is coming much more, the use is really has expanded to many different areas. In Canada, and I think in many countries, we're also seeing the evolution of the healthcare providers that are now starting to reimburse the whole genome sequencing. I am originally from Colombia, and I support the healthcare system there in some of their, I advise and provide some support to the healthcare system in terms of genomics. And I see that they are moving more and more towards the reimbursement and towards really asking for the whole genome, instead of maybe asking for one genetic test here, one genetic test here, and trying to figure out the diagnosis. At the end of the day, is more cost effective and much more, the efficacy of a whole genome sequence is much higher in terms of getting to the right diagnosis and potentially getting to the right treatment at the right time, than just waiting and trying to do all kinds of other tests that are also very expensive. We have done some economic studies here in Canada where, a patient that has a rare disease that has to wait until they are maybe 8-10 years old and go from doctor to doctor, specialist to specialist, a biopsy, another test, they end up spending in the healthcare system about $50,000, $60,000, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, as opposed to, as you say, $1,000 for a whole genome sequence, where you get your diagnosis right away, and you will be able to guide potentially opportunities for treatment, or at least give the family the right diagnosis and make sure they know what and how to care about that patient. So I do think that genomics is already becoming standard of care for many conditions, and I think will become in the future just really a technology that will be part of all our lives, like informatics. I do think there's already many countries that are thinking about newborn sequencing. So you're born, you get your genome, and that's it. You get your family history. Typically your family had in this side of the family these diseases and this other. Well, same with your genome. You will know your genome. You have your genome in a card. You will be able to know what medications are good for you, and you can metabolize. What are the predispositions you have for certain diseases? If you have to do colonoscopy early because you have a susceptibility for colon cancer, or if you have to do frequent mammographies because you have a susceptibility for breast cancer, everything will be there, and you will be able to care and really be much more involved and proactive in your own healthcare.
Right. I think newborn genome sequencing will really make the healthcare industry maybe 10 steps forward, and I'm really looking forward for possibly like a genome sequencing being must for healthcare, because the benefits will be humongous. Would you like to explain what precision medicine is and how it's going to transform healthcare?
Yes, and it's interesting, Eddie, because there are many names that have been used for, some people call it personalized medicine, some other people call it precision medicine. But at the end of the day, we're all talking about the same thing, and that is basically using genomics and omic-related technologies, proteomics, metabolomics, transcriptomics, all the omic technologies, to really get to a very precise diagnosis of your disease or your condition, or if we're talking about prevention, as I was saying, help you get your personal profile, like your deep personal profile with all the omic technologies, and with that understand what are the risks for you to have certain diseases. How can we treat if you have one disease? How can we diagnose in a more precise way? How can we then treat in a more precise way? So is really the use of omic technologies to get a much more molecular, detailed and precise diagnosis and treatment of diseases, and more also in precision health. We're talking about health instead of talking about disease. We want to be able to avoid people getting into a hospital because we want to keep people healthy. I want to know ahead of time if I'm going to be developing a breast cancer so that I can prevent it. I can do the mammography. I can detect it earlier before is any, big growth or big metastases or bigger health challenges. So it's all that concept of focusing on prevention, focusing on understanding the risk, and using your DNA to better understand how to diagnose and treat the diseases if you have them.
So genome sequencing is going to completely upend the way we do healthcare. Then there is genetic editing. We are now able to snip, edit, add a certain genome, and that can really completely upend the healthcare. Though you were saying that, I mean, it's becoming more affordable and accessible. But recently, I think there was a genetic therapy done for a sickle cell treatment in America, and that the cost of that was $1.85 million for a patient. When do you think gene therapy is going to be affordable and accessible, and what would it take to make genetic editing or gene therapy accessible for all?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, our first step with genomics has been to read the DNA. So, if you think about if we're an editor, we read, that's the first step. We read the book of life. We make that process in that technology, which is sequencing, called sequencing, reading the DNA. We make it cheaper, faster, more effective, higher throughput, all that, and that's happening. Second step is we edit, as you mentioned, we go into gene editing. We just not only read, but we can make the changes in certain letters and modify the DNA. And that's the second step of the big genomic revolution. The third one is when you are able to write that DNA. And that's then synthetic biology, when you can really almost make a synthetic molecule of DNA or synthetic cell. Now, for your question on gene editing and gene therapy, there are lots of evolutions and lots of applications of gene editing that are moving ahead. And one big push for those applications has also been COVID-19. We saw the development of mRNA vaccines. Some of them could be tweaked and modified and edited in a way that could be adapted for new variants, adapted for changes in the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So we're seeing more and more advances in how we can use these technologies. There's also lots of applications, not just in human health, but in agriculture for gene editing, which are huge potential for economic impact. In human health, there is still a lot also in terms of our ethical concerns when we are talking about modifying embryos, modifying babies, modifying somatic cells. We're thinking more about specific therapies that target certain cells or certain regions of the body that are not really modifying our entire organism. And so there is a lot of regulation. There is a lot of ethical, again, and legal concerns about the gene editing, but it's more and more used also in laboratory practices just to help understand some of the variants, create some of these variants in the lab. Now, in terms of the cost challenges that you mentioned on gene therapy, I think we are also improving there, where we're seeing now in cases like, I can talk about cystic fibrosis, which there is now medication that is specific for patients that have one particular mutation. And that medication will cost maybe $1,000 a day per patient, which is impossible to afford. But the efficacy is almost 100%. So I think those are the ethical dilemmas and the very difficult decisions that healthcare providers are facing right now, because they say, well, I have the potential to give this, it's just one patient, is one treatment, but it's high, very high efficacy. And really the cost is almost prohibitive. I know, for instance, in Colombia, lots of these technologies will not be able, I would say 99.9% of the patients will not be able to access those new technologies. So I think our goal is, I would say, the key goal now for genomics, and not just for gene therapy and gene editing, but also in general for sequencing. I think the biggest goal now is the goal of equity and access. Is that, yeah, we have the genomic revolution is here now. And how can we ensure that the entire planet and that emerging economies and patients in isolated regions and patients with very limited resources can access these technologies? A little bit like, again, what happened with informatics. At one point was only certain groups that had access to computers. But now with cell phones, we had lots of functionalities that are easy to get everywhere. So we need to get to the cell phone stage with genomics, so that this is a technology that touches everyone, every life around the world.
Right. Yes. I mean, that would be so awesome when it starts getting equitable and accessible for all. And I guess that's such a huge conversation where everybody, all the stakeholders, need to come together and see how that problem can be solved. Talking about the applications, because you mentioned it's not just healthcare, it's agriculture. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more about that? Because just recently I read that Verve Therapeutics is working on genetic editing to prevent heart attacks. They're going to be altering human genomes to prevent the buildup of bad cholesterol, and this, they say, might be a permanent solution to heart disease. So what are the other applications? And maybe you could touch on healthcare, and then maybe also agriculture and climate change.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what is interesting is that many of the companies working on maybe new therapies or new approaches are using, in some cases, their learnings from rare diseases and applying this to common diseases. In the case of the example you're giving, there are some companies that are using what happens in families that have a very high cholesterol, where they produce lots of, even if you have a very restricted diet and exercise, and you're kind of the most healthy person in terms of lifestyle, you still have these plaques of the atherosclerotic plaques and the high cholesterol and all that is building, and lots of that is genetic. So you can, in those individual groups and families, so you can use that learning on what genes are involved and how maybe you can block that genes and modify those genes to make people more resistant to develop that plaque. So it's a learning that you really can get in some cases coming from rare diseases. So again, lots of applications in medicine, not just for making the right diagnosis, but guiding us also into potential treatments, innovative treatments, and innovative ways of preventing. Because at the end of the day, what we want is to prevent. We don't want to treat your heart attack. We want to prevent the plaque to form in your arteries so that you don't ever have a heart attack. That would be the goal, that you remain a healthy person. So again, more and more we're focusing on those preventions and decrease of risk of disease risk. Now, other areas like agriculture, well, we have many ways of using genomics in the agri-food sector, and in particular around climate change. I would say for climate change, that is one of the biggest challenges, I would say, after the pandemic, and they're all related. But the biggest challenge we have in the world now is climate change. And we can use genomics to help us understand what's happening with climate change and think about how we can use then the DNA, the code of life, to map biodiversity. We're already using genomics to map biodiversity across the world. Where are those species that are extinct? Where are those species that have moved from one place to another one? Species that we didn't see in the north, suddenly we're now seeing in the north. Species that we didn't see in the south. So the biodiversity of our planet and distribution of species. So understanding the impact of climate change with genomics is a very important part. Second part is adapting, and agriculture is big on that. We have projects here that are using genomics to select trees or select crops that will grow in certain conditions with low water or conditions with lots of water, conditions with lots of heat, or maybe milder weather. So depending on the weather, you can select really what crops will grow in which regions. And I would say the third one, which is the most powerful one, is mitigation. So, we can understand the climate change with genomics. We can adapt our crops, our forests, our trees, our plants, and our ecosystems to the climate change. But it's the best of all is to be able to mitigate climate change. And just to give you an example, we have with Genome Canada, we have projects where we are using certain enzymes to give in the for feeding livestock. So you just add these enzymes to the normal feed of the livestock, and you are reducing by 60, 70% their methane emissions. And as you know, so that makes the feed much more efficient, again, less waste and less carbon emissions and less methane emissions. And as we know, cows and livestock and lots of the animals are big producers of methane emissions. And we, with that very high energetic, feeding and food for those animals, we can then address some of these challenges around climate change.
How cool is this? The tool that we're having as technology, it's creating so many impact and transformation, and these are just the in such a very nascent stage. We understanding that how it's going to upend human lives and society. So I'm excited on how technology is going to augment human life, and I would like to get into the conversation of the moral and ethical implication. But before I get into that, I would like to address, this to the listeners, that technology is never good or bad. It's the ones who leverage it, and how you leverage it becomes, whether it's good or bad. So keeping that in mind, when we talking about genomics, there are scientists who jumped a little ahead, specifically in China, and there was designer babies. Then we with genetic editing, you said that we have the tool to tinker around with the code of life. That itself, the conversation is so deep that, if you get into what those ACTGs are, is it just code? It's going to take possibly a day. But talking about the moral and ethical implication, what are the danger areas of the genetic editing? Is it bio warfare? Is it designer baby? Is it just the tool that today we understand the source code of life, and someday we could re-engineer or redesign a new form of life itself, possibly superhuman mutants? Is that something that concerns you, or are you just excited that this could be the evolution of mankind?
Yes, well, this is a really interesting question and very relevant, because, as you say, there's no good or bad technology. It's how we use that technology. And we get back to the analogy with computers. Same way, you can have a really good use of computers. You can have a very good use of informatics and all the IT technologies. But you can also be a hacker, and you can do, lots of damage to the planet using exactly the same technology that you can use for good or you can use for bad. In genomics, there are now lots of regulations on how genomics can be used, when they can be used, in particular for gene editing. As I say, there's lots of ethical commissions and lots of, again, gates and regulations. For us at Genome Canada, one of our highlights is that for every large-scale project that we're funding, there has to be, as we call, genes and society or genomics and society component. So always thinking of what will be the social impact of that project? What is the ethical aspects that we're touching with this project? What are the legal, social, economical aspects of this project? It's not just the science because of the science and because science is cool, let's do all kinds of science. It's responsible science. It's science that is really helping us get to be a better society, a better planet, and that is supporting to have a better healthcare system, not just thinking about the perfect babies, the modified babies, but babies that will, as I say, with rare diseases that have the risk to have a very severe, debilitating disease. How can we use genomics to help those cases more than just creating the perfect baby or creating the perfect life? That, by the way, doesn't really, is more of a science fiction than a reality.
You were the chief operating officer at Ruta N Medellin, and where you used cutting edge technologies and approaches to solve cities' social and economical challenges. Now, emerging economies like Colombia, India are just discovering, how these tools or how technologies can benefit, the nation and cities. So would you have advice for, like India, and how do you think we can leverage technologies to create a better societal and economical benefit?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I came back to Colombia to work as chief operating officer for Ruta N in Medellin, my hometown, which is about 4 million people for just downtown or the center of the city, and about 7 million we take into account the surrounding towns and all these. So yeah, in a country that is 52 million inhabitants, where genomics in technologies in general are starting to play a key role in the economic development of the country. So what I think one of the key learnings from me in terms of the role of technology in emerging economies and countries like Colombia, like India, and others, is that there is room for, there's an important role for genomics and an important role for technology in general, but there is no need to really reinvent everything. We published with a group of colleagues an article that was called, where we had an analogy there saying that in developing countries, we should be focusing on the second best winner, not just focusing on initially doing all this huge research and huge investments in, of course, investing in research is important, but it's more looking at how can we apply these in a very clever way. And I know, in India, I know so many examples, and also in Colombia, of entrepreneurs that are creating companies, or scientists that are bringing value, or healthcare providers that are using these tools to really get to concrete solutions, not just the science because of the science, but I think we have this sense that we can use this to solve challenges, and not just I would say healthcare challenges, but really global and societal challenges. And I think that's the dimension that emerging economies and countries like Colombia, India can bring to the table too. And is that concept of, again, equity, access, diversity, bringing those diverse voices. In genomics in particular, we have a big challenge because about 80% of the international databases for genomics are only white Caucasian individuals, which is a huge challenge, because that means that when we are studying those databases and we're thinking about new diagnoses or new treatments, the new diagnoses and the new treatments we're thinking with those databases are for Caucasians, are not for the population in India, are not for the population in Colombia. We have different genes, we have different variations. So I think it's important also to bring that concept in our countries to say, well, we need to have a voice too. We need to really show that whatever is developed in all the countries cannot immediately be applied without any, adaptation to our realities in our countries. The last thing I want to say that was critical for us and for me when I was working in Colombia is that more than concentrating in generating the data is what can we do with that data? Is all the crossroads also with quantum computing, with AI. And again, India has such a driving force in data and data management, data use, data analytics. So I think using that data is really the new oil. It's not our capacity to sequence genomes. We can sequence genomes, yeah. But really, what do we do with that data? How we manage that data? And I think that's where we come to the more than the capacity to buy a machine to sequence is the person that is able, the bioinformatician, the computational biologist that is able to analyze that data in a clever way and that is able to make those connections with the social needs, with the social challenges, with the realities we have in our countries and in our environments.
Right. I mean, yeah, if we there's such an urgent need to create, possibly like a standard operating procedure for maybe a genome sequencing for everyone. That way, possibly, we'll have, like you mentioned, it's 80% of only white Caucasians of the data that we have. I hope that, this kind of changes, we have like a more wider, diverse amount of data. And yes, India, there are a lot of engineers over here, and the role of AI machine learning is going to play a huge role in giving us more answers on what the data can do and how it can be actually leveraged for healthcare. So I'm excited for the space. Thank you, Doctor. It was really a pleasure talking to you, understanding your insights and what you're building. If you had to paint a picture of what the next 10 years is going to look like with genomics, with technology, with innovations, with collaboration, what would you have to say? And possibly maybe you could also talk about your moonshot and Genome Canada's moonshot.
Absolutely. Well, for me, the next 10 years, we will see, again, genomics out of the lab and penetrating our life in everything we do, from the food we eat, the house, how we're built, the wood we have, the health, our healthcare, our capacity to prevent diseases. We have most of us the access to these technologies in a way or in another one. So I think it's a technology that's going to transform every single part of our lives and will have an impact in every single component of what we see, the living organisms around us. So for me, of course, I'm excited. This is my field, and I think this is going to continue transforming the world. And for us at Genome Canada, we're just launching right now, actually on May 12th, we launched a very large initiative on climate change and genomics, focusing on the agri-food system and agriculture and food production for a more sustainable future. We're focusing on the mitigation aspect, which as I mentioned, is a very challenging one, but we believe that genomics is going to play a key role in Canada in helping Canada. We're a big agriculture country, and using this technology to advance in a much more sustainable and greener economy, it will be critical. And that's our moonshot. That's our next best bet.
Lovely, Doctor. Really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast, and I hope that whatever you're working on, comes to fruition, because we hope that someday maybe those learnings can be leveraged to other nations, and those other nations can benefit, in their food production, agriculture, climate change, which is such a huge problem, and also healthcare. So thank you once again for being part of the podcast. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. And until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye. Thank you, Doctor. Really appreciate this.
Thank you. Yeah, and maybe, I don't know if you can insert, because one last comment I would like to say is that as part of my moonshot is, I think, again, the equity and the access That's going to be my personal moonshot. You know, the genomics is going to be everywhere, but my personal that I'm going to fight forever is to make sure everybody can access this technology.